What makes an invasion fair? Can an invasion be fair? Should an invasion be fair? How do we even define fairness? This is the first video in a short series that will answer some, if any, of these questions at inconsistent length and specificity. Let us begin. Invasions in Elden Ring fill a specific role, much as the same as previous titles. A red summon appears suddenly in your world and now it's on. You and your hapless friend have little time to react, and there's a good chance you're unprepared. The red sets upon you like a demon, no doubt trying some absurd or overpowered strategy to make sure you don't stand a chance. Or maybe you are prepared. You've taunted reds to purposefully lure them into your world with your own absurd or overpowered strategy, usually in the form of a couple friends, to make sure they don't stand a chance. In either of these invasions, is one more fair than the other? Is it definitive or purely contextual? Is it all conjecture? And what role do our choices play in all this? Elden Ring and the rest of the series have a unique context because of their unique gameplay. They are both single-player and multiplayer games, with a not insignificant part of that multiplayer being competitive. In most competitive multiplayer games, it's the primary focus, often considered the main game, while any single-player content is considered secondary or less. In other games that feature PvP such as MMOs, PvP game modes are often on the other side of the PvE content. But in the Souls series, the separation is far more nuanced. There is often no clear-cut separation between competitive and cooperative multiplayer, or even between multiplayer and single-player. It all happens seamlessly. In Elden Ring, you have degrees of engaging with multiplayer as well as the option to not engage at all. The most basic form comes from messages, specters, and bloodstains, passive markings that appear in-world to inform one player of another's journey. These are generally non-intrusive and serve as a way to remind the player that they are going through a shared experience. The more involved form comes from active multiplayer, both cooperative and competitive, summoned allies and enemies actively controlled by other players. Cooperators are summoned manually and remain in-game until an area is cleared. Competitors can also be summoned voluntarily, but the more common occurrence is centered around invasions. Invasions are, as you almost certainly understand, an extremely controversial mechanic. People tend to love them or hate them, with not a lot of middle ground to speak of. But invasions are core to the design logic of the game and are a pragmatic approach to both player agency and game balance. We see this demonstrated in Elden Ring. To be invaded, you must meet specific requirements. Specifically, Elden Ring makes a clear distinction by only allowing for invasions while a host is cooperating, tethering the mechanics intrinsically. You must choose to engage with multiplayer before you can be invaded, making invasions as much a feature of that multiplayer as the cooperation itself. From a design perspective, we might draw the conclusion that the two are opposing halves of the same whole, with one not intended to exist without the other. Evidence for this is present in-game. Of the 3 additional player slots in a given multiplayer session, 2 are available to friendly summons by default, and the last is available only to an invader. The Taunter's Tongue can adjust these slots by making one of the 2 friendly slots available to either an invader or cooperator, but it never removes the invader's slot. From this implementation alone, we should be able to conclude with sound reasoning that invasions are an intended part of the multiplayer experience. And yet, there is a large portion of the player base who disagrees with this line of reasoning. They claim invasions are wrong or unfair, perpetuated only by the worst humanity has to offer, that invasions invalidate their own choices of how they want to play the game. I have people tell me time and again that invaders have no business in their game, when they just want to play with their friends and not have someone show up and wreck everything. What they are suggesting when they say this is that they do not believe being invaded is their choice. They believe they are having a consequence thrust upon them unrelated to their actions, an unjust and unwarranted punishment. They are excusing themselves of any responsibility, laying the blame squarely at the feet of the invader and from software. This is the logic of anyone facing consequences for doing something they want. They want to cooperate and they do not want to be invaded because they view cooperation as a reward, as an entitlement, and invasion as a punishment. But this logic is fundamentally flawed. It is cherry-picking at its most fruitful. It's a lot like saying if you want to cheat, You should be allowed to. Fundamentally, you as a person have every right to approach something however you wish, but if we consider playing the game to be playing by the game's rules, you'd just be cheating. Now, assuming cooperation is something every player is entitled to is not a wrong assumption, but assuming it should not come with any trade offs is. The vast majority of the game is designed for solo play, and all multiplayer aspects are entirely optional, so to suggest that it can't have pros and cons demonstrates a basic misunderstanding of the game or possibly even a general disrespect for the integrity thereof, where challenge and adversity are trademark aspects. Though it is not uncommon for a player to claim or otherwise imply they do not care for the challenge or adversity of the game, and that the game should work how they want it to. After all, it is their game. But this line of thinking goes against every single aspect of what the game is offering. It implies the player knows best and suggests the intended experience is secondary or possibly a non-factor. But what it really comes down to is that players like to pick and choose what they approve of. When they like something, it's good. When they don't like something, it's bad. Plain and simple. But as narrow and one-dimensional as I find this rationale, I don't want to push too hard on people who are simply having a violent reaction to violent acts. My entire channel up to this point has been essentially dedicated to the exploration of this sort of reasoning and my efforts to help people understand the merits of invasions in a positive way. I want to encourage people to try invasions for themselves and gain the perspective necessary to appreciate them as a mechanic, to help people see that it's not evil or wrong to invade and that it's a part of the game's logic with meaning, that it's a great opportunity for fun to be had by all involved. I understand not everyone enjoys PvP and that it won't always be fun, but I also understand that people can learn to love things if they keep an open mind. Dark Souls was criticized by many for its challenge and obtuse design choices, but those are the same things that helped to make it great and convinced people the series was worth playing. In much the same way, invading is a friction mechanic that allows players to self-govern in a way seldom explored in games. Most MMOs will relegate PvP to specific areas where players make a risk-reward based decision by choosing to enter, but will most commonly choose to avoid any level of risk because the idea of losing to another player, in any mechanical setting, is too real and too harsh. Elden Ring has the same risk-reward metric, but it has much better engaged its audience. By tethering invasions to cooperation, invading is the risk you take for the reward of playing with friends. While there are many issues with the overall functionality of the system, I think this is a great way to incentivize PvP. It makes it part of the game as much or as little as you want while not compromising on design. It's not something as silly as flagging for PvP whenever you feel like it, but instead the idea of joining a party automatically flagging you for PvP. Every game that incorporates PvP should consider this mechanic. I'm looking at you, WoW. But still, even if the reasoning is sound, there are people who reasonably themselves do not want PvP. They don't want to deal with the unpredictability of an opposing player, or they don't think they can win, or they just aren't in the mood. That's very fair, and I don't blame people for feeling that way. And Elden Ring has given those people a consistent, reliable tool that lets them choose when they want to PvP by choosing when they participate in active multiplayer. They have made the system entirely opt-in and given adequate incentive to do so. That is a rare and intelligent mechanical implementation. The game isn't trying to lure you into a full loot zone where the risk of losing all your gear is balanced against potentially taking someone else's. It's not trying to make you go to the optional danger zone for some quest where you will certainly be killed if discovered. It's saying, hey, if you want to engage in multiplayer, you are eligible for all forms of multiplayer. If not, then you can play the game solo. And as much as I miss solo host invasions, I think the system is conceptually sound. You have a considerable degree of control around the pacing of your game with multiplayer as a primary dial. However you progress, it's your choice. Whenever you face a challenging area, you have conveniently located summoning pools and graces to call for aid and progress as a group, but with the risk of an invader coming in to counterbalance your advantage. The system is even more generous when it comes to boss fights. Whenever you want to summon allies for a boss fight, the run to the boss is almost always such a short distance that an invader doesn't have time to be summoned in, and if they are, they're kicked the second you enter the boss fight. Essentially, the game ensures that any fog-gated boss is a challenge for you and your summons, and the only counterbalance is the boss's increased health. So all of those systems should indicate that invasions are given real consideration regarding their fairness and when you can and can't be invaded. But the when and why of invasions are not the only factors. Balance has been a major sore spot between invaders and hosts, owing to the wide range of options and vast skill gaps that are not well accounted for. A common complaint regarding invasions is that no matter how much the odds are stacked against an invader, they will always have the advantage because they know more about the game and are a higher skill player. Some even go so far as to paint all invaders as players willing to exploit the worst and most broken techniques to get a kill that honest, decent players would never even consider. There is some truth to this accusation. There are many invaders who see people complaining about invasions and make it their personal mission to teach them a lesson the hard way. They do not like the negativity aimed at their favorite hobby and choose to express themselves through incredible violence. But that is those players' choice. The game empowers them to play their way as much as it empowers their targets to play theirs. It embodies the very nature of invasions and, by extension, fairness itself. Invasions are an attack on an eligible player. The way the invasion plays out is up to every single player involved. Some players dislike that. Some players view the choice to invade as actively invalidating their own. But again, I feel I must remind everyone who feels this way, they choose when they can be invaded and cannot claim they bear no responsibility. They don't have to like it, but that is the game they have chosen to play. Even still, even with every reason I have given, players who hate invasions will still claim they are unfair. I have heard time and again that some players wouldn't mind invasions if only invaders weren't so disreputable and underhanded, if only they chose to play fair. There is a pervasive sense in the community that revolves around some combination of honor, personal integrity, and fair play. At their core, these ideals serve to reinforce a code of conduct between players and create a right way to play. This also has the intended consequence of painting things outside of this code as wrong. Therefore, whenever a player does something another player doesn't like, they are wrong. The code says so. Honor demands it. We all know the truth. This is the heart of any conversation around fairness in PvP. Beyond the scope of cheating and cheesing and game balance, the true determining factor of whether or not something is fair is entirely in the mind of the defeated. Whether or not they choose to approve of their opponent's tactics is the sole arbiter of this false halo. This is a truth of which you are likely well aware. People complain about things they don't like, fair or otherwise. Therefore, fairness itself is a completely subjective metric with no intrinsic value. In a world without absolutes, they are free to pick and choose. And that brings me to the point of this video. We choose how we define fairness, but not only as individuals. We choose as a community how we want the game to be played. Video games, like any other media, are imperfect translations of artistic intent. If you want to do the best, you play the game, not the player. Who cares if crouch poking is cheesy and unrealistic? It does good damage and comes out quick. That's the game. Get good or get dead. But that might not be considered fair. If a loud portion of the player base speaks out against a mechanic or exploit, it becomes unfair, placing users of that option inherently against the grain. But that won't stop people from doing it, instead only serving to generate social friction between players willing to cross an imaginary line and players who want others to stay in their lane. In this and so many other ways, we choose what is right and what is wrong, and we attempt to choose it for others. Now, I want to take a stand here, and I don't want any lip out of any of you about it. This social dissonance is something every game would be better off without. When players decide there's a good and bad way to play a game, especially around a specific mechanic stylized as invading, they impose limits on themselves and others in a way that defeats so much of the purpose of that game. It is good, nay essential, to have your own opinions and feelings about the game and how people play it, but to suggest that there is a morally or objectively correct and incorrect way to play goes against the very idea of player choice and, on a much grander scale, the idea of free will. Games are a way for us to explore the full spectrum of the human condition in a safe and artistic space, so saying any part of that should be off limits when it has been knowingly and willfully included in the game is a complete denial of our ability to choose for ourselves. So let me conclude by stating the obvious. Invasions are an intended and integral part of the multiplayer in Elden Ring and deserve to be experienced by everyone. Being invaded is a choice made by every player participating and should be embraced as a bastion of player agency. Their fairness is a vastly subjective matter, but their existence is as fair as any other mechanic. If you don't want them, you can choose to not open yourself to them, but you cannot choose for others. It's not your game, it's everyone's. That's it for this video. Next week will be a follow-up focusing on some other equally arbitrary aspect of my favorite mechanic in any game. Like the video if you want more of this commentary, and if you aren't already subscribed, please consider doing so. YouTube won't give me a penny until I prove I have a full battalion of trained fighters at my beck and call. Serve your best interests by fighting by me, for me, with me. The choice is yours. Thank you for watching.